Well, guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I'm here with Greg Koukl. We're talking about a really cool new book that just came out. Well, it's actually an old book that was updated, but it's a great book, whatever it is. It's one of my favorite books that I've ever read, in fact. So it's the 10th anniversary edition of Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions, which features about 40% new material. So if you already have the old book like I do, I feel weird calling it the old book. Maybe I shouldn't do that. The original book, maybe that's a better way of saying it. I've said it 1,000 times. I think Tactics is required reading for Christians everywhere. I think every Christian, every single one of you guys watching should read this book. If you want to pick it up, it's in the description. It's real easy to get it, and definitely get the new updated 10th anniversary edition. That's what we'll be talking about today. But if you want to learn more about apologetics, you want to learn and see conversations between Christians and non-Christians, productive conversations, and you want to learn arguments for God's existence you didn't know existed, make sure to subscribe to my channel, turn on the little bell so you can get notifications for new videos. To introduce my guest, Greg received his master's in philosophy of religion and ethics at Talbot School of Theology. He graduated with high honors and his master's in Christian apologetics with honors from Simon Greenleaf University. He's adjunct professor in Christian apologetics at Biola University. He's spoken on more than 70 college and university campuses, both in the U.S. and abroad, and has hosted his own call-in radio show for 27 years, advocating Christianity worth thinking about. He's debated atheist Michael Shermer. He's debated Deepak Chopra on the television show Lee Strobel's Faith Under Fire when that was still going on. An award-winning writer. He's a best-selling author. Greg has written 7 books, including The Story of Reality, How the World Began, How It Ends, and everything important that happens in between. He's written Tactics, the book we'll talk about today, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions, and then also a book on relativism, Feet Firmly Planted in Midair. He's been featured on Focus on the Family Radio. He's been interviewed for CBN and BBC. He's been quoted in Christianity Today, the U.S. News and World Report, and the LA Times. Now, before we get into the interview, I just want to personally thank every single one of you that has helped me reach 100% support on Patreon so that I can do ministry full-time. It's amazing. I do want to emphasize, though, that 100% is my personal goal. I still have a ministry goal. I'm about 75% on the way there, the ministry goal. The additional funds are going to go to paying monthly services like website and software subscriptions. I got to pay an accountant now to keep all the money organized and everything. Travel expenses, paying independent contractors like videographers and animators, and eventually I'd like to pay to fly guests out to do in-person interviews in Houston. So the vision, my vision for Capturing Christianity extends way beyond just me, way beyond just giving myself a paycheck or being able to do this full-time. It goes way beyond that. I want to eventually have something like what Greg has, where it's a ministry that has several different people employed doing all this kind of work all over the world. So if you want to help me take Capturing Christianity to the next level, head over to patreon.com/Capturing Christianity and join the team. All right, that was a lot, but let's go ahead and get into the interview here. Let me pull up my interview scene so everyone can see your beautiful face. We're talking about evangelism, how to share your faith with skeptics, Tactics, your book on a game plan for sharing your faith, your Christian convictions. Well, first tell me about your goal, your original goal of writing Tactics when you wrote it back when did you actually write this one?
Well, this came 10 years ago is when it came out. So I was putting it together a couple of years before that. And actually we had some CDs or DVDs. Maybe we had cassette tapes. I don't know, way back when. But the whole point was to get this material into play in some way because it was having such a powerful impact in my own life and in the lives of people I was teaching it to, kind of live in front of audiences at churches and stuff. And I thought, well, let's get a book going. And it took me a while to put that book together, but it came out 10 years ago. And I have both copies here, the old copy and the new one. And I don't know if people can see that the new one is a lot thicker than the old one. And when I heft it, I feel, there's all that extra work that I put into, yes, the old one. We'll call it the old one so people will want to get the new one. But you're right, it is the original. But there's so much more, Cameron, in the new edition.
Yeah, there's 40% new material. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I've almost doubled the number of tactics there. I have 6 new chapters. But to get back to your question, though, it is not easy to navigate discussions with with non-believers. Just to put it simply, everybody knows that, especially now the culture is getting increasingly hostile, not just to Christianity and to the cross. I mean, the cross has always been a stumbling block. But now it's hostile to virtually everything relevant to a Christian understanding of reality. What it means to be human, what it means to be male and female, what the word truth means, what the notion of salvation is. All of these things and many more are under attack. It's a full court press. Therefore, people are not really excited about the idea of engaging, because it's going to look more like D-Day, they think, than diplomacy. And the book Tactics was meant to reverse that trend and to make our engagements look more like diplomacy than D-Day. And also to provide, and this is a very important concept here, an important bridge that has been missing. Now, you and I have gone to lots of conferences where we learn important things from the smart guys, and getting information is really good. The problem is, how do we get that information into play? How do we go from the content to the conversation? How do we go from the scholarship to the relationship? And that's the missing bridge that Tactics provides. How do we know how to step through a conversation in a relaxed fashion, even if we don't know very much about philosophy or theology or apologetics, even if we're fairly new Christians? How can we make a difference with a pretty strong skeptic or critic or whatever who's pushing back aggressively? I make a promise in the book that I make to every audience that I speak to, and I tell them that I'm going to give them a game plan that will allow them to converse with confidence in any situation, no matter how little they know, or how knowledgeable or aggressive or even obnoxious the other person happens to be. And so I keep that promise every time I speak.
So with your new book, has the goal changed at all, or is it still fundamentally the same goal?
It is the same goal. I'm trying to accomplish the same thing, ergo the same title and the same subtitle. What I've done is I've added to it two things. What I have learned in the last 10 years about navigating more effectively, and so that would mean new tactics that weren't in the book originally, the old book, but now show up. One whole chapter on a tactic I call Inside Out, another chapter of a series of what I call mini tactics. These are simple maneuvers that can be employed fairly easily, and I explain what those are. And so,
was that the one that included the one about Jesus? I was actually reading through. I don't have the actual physical copy. I have it on Kindle, but was that the one that mentions I forget the name of it, but it was about Jesus.
Actually, the name's kind of easy to remember. What a friend we have in Jesus. There you go. It's the old hymn. So, and funny little historical thing. My great uncle wrote that song. He was one of the co-authors of that song. I didn't learn that until I became a believer. And anyway, Charles Converse. But that particular tactic is part of one of the mini tactics, and that idea there is you use Jesus, you get Jesus on your side in any conversation that you can. So if somebody says, "Hey, you guys are narrow-minded, arrogant, whatever, for thinking that your way is the only way," I could say, "Well, look, it's not my idea. I didn't invent this. This was Jesus' idea."
Yeah, so really what you're doing is you're disagreeing with Jesus. And most people in our culture, at least we're talking about America here, most people in our culture don't want to disagree with Jesus because everyone thinks he's like a great guy. Even though they might not subscribe to everything he taught, you still don't want to. I guess it makes them uncomfortable to disagree with him. And so
yeah, everybody likes Jesus. I think you're right about that, Cameron. That's why they want Jesus on their own team. They'll say things like, Jesus never said anything about homosexuality. No, I don't think that's entirely true, but look at the impulse. The impulse is to say, Jesus is on my side on this issue, and he's a heavyweight. I agree, he is a heavyweight. Let's use him to our advantage by quoting him accurately when it's appropriate. And there's a whole section on how to do that.
So which part of the new book are you most excited about?
Let me add one other thing before we move to that, and that is, I said there were two things going on. One is the new tactics. Another one is that in 10 years, not only have I learned new maneuvers, but I have learned better ways of explaining the old ones. And I lay out in a much more clear fashion a concept that I call the distinction between harvesting and gardening, okay, that we need a lot more gardeners out there because unless you can't have a harvest unless you have a season of gardening. And the tactics book is meant to do that most effectively, not necessarily getting to the end game, getting people to pray to receive Christ or anything like that, but rather just to get in there and, as I put it in the book, put a stone in their shoe. Just do a little here, a little there. And by lowering the bar a little bit, that's going to get more Christians off of the bench and into play because now they have a game plan that allows them to do that. There you go.
I actually gave a talk the other day, and I was referencing something you said in tactics where you basically say that you go into conversations without the goal of trying to win them to Christ or trying to convert them on the spot.
Exactly.
And that kind of takes people by surprise because you think that when you're doing evangelism, you need to seal the deal on the first try, basically. And you give the analogy of the baseball player who, instead of trying to hit a home run, is just trying to get on base.
That's right. And actually in the tactics stuff, I just want people to get in the batter's box because we have an ally, and that's the Holy Spirit. And he can help take it from there if we have a way of getting up to bat. And that's the idea of the concept of tactics. Let's just here's a game plan that will allow you to get into play in a very simple way where there's a lot of safety for the Christian, and then we'll see what God does.
So one of the tactics that you're most well known for is the Columbo Tactic.
Right.
So just take a second and explain what that tactic is, because there's really like 3 different facets of it. Let's do a quick overview, and then I have a question about street epistemology.
Yeah. And I remember last time we talked, you suggested I change that name because people don't know who that is, but I'm sticking with it because a lot of people do, and if they don't know, I'm just going to tell them who it is. It's like people don't know who Aristotle is. All right, well, let's tell them. Or Jesus, So anyway, Columbo was a character of a TV show many years ago, the late Pleistocene period, where he was a detective who solved murder mysteries by coming in very unassuming and actually looking kind of dumb. He had a rumpled trench coat. He had a stub of a cigar. He had a pad of paper he couldn't use because he didn't bring a pen or pencil. He had to bum that off of somebody else so he could take notes. I mean, this guy seemed totally innocuous. Nothing to be scared about, all right? But then he starts asking questions. And it's this manner that he has and the simple process of asking questions that allows him to gather the information he needs to figure out who is probably the bad guy, and then to zero in on that person with other questions that are more pointed or more deliberately asked in order to basically in order to trap the bad guy, to demonstrate that he's guilty. Now, in a certain sense, we are not trying to trap Christians in a hostile way. That's the Bogosian technique, that your street epistemology technique. We are trying to help them using principles of clear thinking to see that their ideas are not sound in some way and that we can offer something better by the way of an answer to explaining reality and the human condition. And so that's how we maneuver with tactics. We're not trying to manipulate people. We are trying to manage the conversation. We're trying to stay in the driver's seat of the conversation so that it goes in the direction that we want it to go.
So I want to remind everyone, we're talking about tactics, and this is the old version. The new version is the 10th anniversary edition he's got it. There you go. Hold it up on the screen. Whoops, dropped something on the floor. There's 40% more material in the 10th anniversary edition. So if you have the old version, pick up the new one. It's awesome. I've already been reading through it, and the new information is great. Actually, that's what I want to go to next, is you have a whole new chapter, and you mentioned street epistemology explicitly. And so I have a couple questions about that. The first one is, well, why don't you go ahead and just explain, you mentioned it briefly, but for anyone who might not know, what is street epistemology? What does my audience need to know about that movement?
Well, street epistemology is a term that's associated with the training material of the atheist Peter Bogosian out of Portland State University. And he has written a training manual I think the title is A Manual for Creating Atheists.
That's right.
And it's basically a tactics book for atheists. There's a lot of the same principles that are in his book that are in mine as well. No, I don't think he read tactics, mine, but I think that a lot of these notions are fairly common sense notions that have been in play by different people because of their persuasive power. But what the book Tactics does, and what he does in his book, is to be intentional about outlining how these things work. Now, his goal, though, is very interesting what he teaches in his book. He tells his atheist disciples, do not argue for atheism. He tells them, do not argue against theism. Instead, just ask probing questions. Now, they're not innocent questions. They're questions that are going to what he thinks is the supreme weakness of any religious view. And the weakness is that all of these views are built on faith, which, I'm being very careful in my words here, which he defines and describes as believing something that you have no good reason to believe. He uses different words, but it amounts to the same thing. Faith is blind, and if it's not blind, it isn't faith, according to his definition. Now, unfortunately, a lot of Christians have that same understanding, which you and I both know is not biblical in the least. The Bible is filled with arguments and argumentation and rationale and reasons and evidence ad infinitum. Every page you turn, you're going to find something like that. The first preachment there on Acts chapter 2 during that period, actually open to the first couple lines of the book of Acts, Jesus appeared with many convincing proofs. And then in the first preachment in Acts chapter 2 on Pentecost Sunday, there is Peter preaching the resurrection as evidence that Jesus is the Messiah, and on and on and on. And by the way, thousands were converted. So much for the claim that nobody is won to Christ through an argument. There it is in Acts chapter 2.
Yeah, and the four Gospels themselves are an argument in a sense. I mean,
that's right.
That's the reason that we have them, is so that we can have the apostolic witness. Anyways.
So with Peter Bogosian's crowd, though, they're very cagey because they are trading on a misunderstanding that they help create it. Well, let's put it this way. I think that Christians have been vulnerable to and maybe created themselves in some ways, but now guys like Bogosian take advantage of and
they're exploiting it.
And exploiting it because they magnify it. In fact, in his book, he says, don't let some apologists tell you that faith means trust. Don't let them get away with that. Why not? That is what it means. Because the word faith, pisteo, in the New Testament means active trust. It doesn't just mean mental assent, and it doesn't mean belief without evidence, which is the way he wants to make it. So armed with this idea, what they're going to do is start asking questions of Christians about their faith, okay, given that understanding of faith. And he's got lots of dialogues in there that he's had and he encourages others to have. And he has some extra material too, some in favor of atheism and against Christianity. But this is a new challenge. It's a challenge when people are using things like the Columbo Tactic, which is the basic game plan. That one tactic is our game plan. The other tactics abet the game plan, but the central tactic is the question-asking technique that is so effective that even atheists can use it. And so there's a chapter in there called Turnabout that talks about what Christians do when someone is using questions against them in an illicit way.
Yeah, okay, so one thing I want to point out is that questions never lack teleology. They never lack a purpose. When you ask a question, you're always trying to get at something. So street epistemologists a lot of times will say, well, I'm not trying to create atheists. I'm not trying to instill doubt in people. Some of them will admit this, but a lot of times they'll say, well, I'm just asking questions. Nobody just asks questions. That doesn't happen. When you ask a question, you're trying to get something in return. You're trying to either trip this person up, you're trying to instill doubt. Sometimes if it's an honest question and it's just sort of like, maybe I don't understand what you're saying, what I'm trying to get is clarification. So you're always trying to get something from someone when you ask them a question. I think that's really important to point out with street epistemology.
It's good observation, and they're always going somewhere. In fact, if they're saying, I'm not trying to create doubt or not trying any of that stuff that you mentioned, well, that's just not honest. And see, this is a difference between our approach and his approach in that what we're trying to do is use questions to gather information, to understand people's reasons for things, and to make a point. Nothing wrong with that.
Well, and then also one of the things I like to point out is that in your book, you also have a whole chapter on just the facts, which is to say that evidence and facts can be persuasive to people. And so it's not just asking questions. At some point, you've got to turn and start to talk about the evidence, but street epistemologists don't do that. I mean, it's not part of their repertoire.
Right. Part of the point of just the facts, ma'am, which is one of the tactics, as you point out, is that there are a lot of arguments or challenges to Christianity that are just falsely based, like religion has created more bloodshed than anything else in the world. No, it hasn't. Atheism has done that. As a matter of fact, that doesn't mean that atheism is false and Christianity is true. That's not the point. But what happens is there are certain points that people make that are just inconsistent with the facts, and just presenting the facts often will help them. The problem with street epistemologists is their facts aren't always sound, like the fact that faith means blind belief. And they insist on that, but that is their definition. I make the point, frankly, in another book, The Story of Reality. I say, look, if you want to define faith any way you want, fine, you can do that. But what you can't do is you can't redefine our definition of faith. That's a straw man. And we're just going to have to be firm with them about this. When I talk about faith, here's what I mean. If you want to defeat my view, then you have to defeat my view, not your false characterization of it.
So in the book, and this is in your new chapter on what chapter is it actually? Because I don't have it pulled up here. What's your chapter title?
Bogosian?
Yeah, you talk about Deepak Chopra and then
Turnabout.
And so it's basically a whole chapter on how to address someone who's using the Columbo tactic against you. And so you say in the book, the best response to street epistemology is to politely refuse to play the question game. So I have two questions about this. First, what do you mean by that? You see what I did there? What do you mean by that? What game are they playing? And then second, doesn't this kind of undermine the point of the Columbo tactic? Couldn't the atheist just say, well, I'm not going to play the Columbo game?
Okay, good. Let me answer both of them. The first one is the game that I'm referring to, and I actually don't use that phrase when I'm talking to the person because that's discreditable. That's a disparaging kind of comment. But this is
negative
connotation. It's a maneuver. It's gamesmanship in that sense, and I'm unashamedly acknowledge that in the book. That what we often try to do is we try to get our opponent, so to speak, as an ally to help us make our argument. So we'll ask one information question from them. They answer it. That puts a piece of information on the table that they agree with. Then we'll ask another question. There's another piece on the table. And then when we get all these pieces on the table, that leads to our conclusion. Now, it's going to be hard for them to take those pieces off the table if they're the ones who put them on there. That's the mentality behind using Columbo in the third sense, which is to make a point. All right. Now, they're doing the same thing with us, right? So how do we defend against it? And the answer is we just observe what they're doing and then point this out. I did this at the University of Alaska earlier this year. And here's what I said. I said, hold on just a minute. It sounds to me like you're trying to make a point by asking a bunch of small questions and getting up there. To be honest, that's a little confusing to me because I don't know quite where you're going. So how about this? Why don't you just make your point and then let me respond to it? All right. Why don't you just make your point and then let me respond to it? So what I'm doing is I'm cutting off the avenue that he's taking that is asking me a bunch of questions that is setting me up for his final maneuver. I don't want to be set up. I don't know where he's going, and I don't know how he's going to take or how my answer to one question is going to sound as it fits into his final conclusion. Maybe I'm not being as careful as I could be in answering the question, so I'm vulnerable. So instead, I'm just going to say, how about if you just tell me your view? You're asking these questions, and I'm not sure where this is going. The best thing probably for me would be just to have your view straight out and then let me respond to it. Now, by the way, that's a very reasonable request. It's basically you're saying I'm not following you in this. I'm not going to follow your lead in this. Just give me your view. Then you have you've cut off that momentum that's you're already feeling uncomfortable. You know what's going on, but you don't know how to get out of it. That's how you get out of it. Okay.
Well, and this is why I pointed out that when someone is asking a question, there's always an intent behind it. There's a purpose why they're asking that question.
Yeah.
So when you use this maneuver, you're basically saying, well, just cut straight to the chase. Tell me the purpose of this questioning,
right,
instead of playing this game, and just tell me what you're trying to get at. Are you trying to tell me that I believe this because of faith and you think faith is bad and I shouldn't believe it because of faith, blah, blah, blah. If that's what you're trying to get at, then just tell me, and then let's have a conversation about that instead of trying to play this game of asking questions and tripping me up and making me look silly.
Yeah. Of course, none of that is the language I'm going to use when I'm talking with them, but that's exactly the point. Now, of course, this is a double-edged sword, because what I teach in tactics is how to do that very thing legitimately so that you can get to a proper conclusion about things. So what if somebody uses the same defensive technique or tactic against me, the turnabout, okay? What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to be polite, and I'm going to acknowledge and listen to their request. If they say, you're asking a bunch of these little questions, it seems like you're leading somewhere and I don't know where you're going, that makes me feel uncomfortable. Do you mind just making your point straight out and then letting me respond to it? What would I do? I'd make my point straight out. But what would have happened in that case is I would have been, in a sense, artfully outmaneuvered just a little bit, causing me to lose a tactical advantage based on what I was trying to do. I'll tell you something, though. I've never had anybody do that to me. I've never had anyone do that to me when I've asked them these kinds of questions. And I have a number of illustrations in that chapter. An attorney that I talked to at a Barnes & Noble about why Jesus is the only way, and Deepak Chopra actually he asked a question that wasn't really a question. It was an attempt to make me look bad. And so I try to get some insight to our readers and how people can assess these kinds of challenges and see the question behind the question, or the motive behind the question, or the move behind the question, and try to dodge it. Now, I'll also say this, Cameron. These are things, as you know, that take a little practice.
Yep.
This isn't where you start. This is a little more advanced stuff. You start with the basic game plan, the first two Columbo questions. What do you mean by that? How did you come to that conclusion? Which, by the way, anyone can ask, even if you're a Christian for one day and you have no theology, no philosophy, no apologetics, never watched Cameron's show, never read any of my books or whatever. Doesn't matter. You can start with these two questions and begin to make headway, and then get more comfortable maneuvering in conversations. Would you say, Cameron, that because you know this game plan and the things that you got out of the old book, that it's helped you significantly to maneuver in tricky conversations?
Whoa. Oh, sorry about that. My daughter just walked into the room. Yeah, let me let you just filibuster for a second while I figure out what just happened.
Okay, I want to make an observation to the rest of you about the Bogosian approach. Because notice I said Bogosian isn't telling his disciples to argue for atheism or against Christian theism, but rather to ask questions. What is he doing? I mentioned a little while ago about the concept that I call gardening, that before any harvest, there's always got to be a season of gardening. What gardening is just a little here, a little there. So as believers, we're not taking responsibility to bring every person we talk to Christ, but I'm suggesting we take responsibility to do just a little bit. And that little bit can have a powerful impact, as witnessed by Peter Bogosian's disciples, who are doing what they call street epistemology. They are planting a stone in people's shoes, the Christian shoes. In fact, you can go online, and maybe you've seen this, Cameron. Welcome back to the show, by the way.
Thanks.
Maybe you've seen this online, where you've got street epistemology videos where there's the atheist with a hat cam on or whatever, GoPro, and he's talking to a couple of Christians who are doing their best to answer the questions he's asking, and he's being just innocuous and relaxed and not here to cause any problem, but help me out here, help me understand. And then the Christians aren't very good at dealing with his issues, and they're shuffling from foot to foot. They're trying to hang on to their views, but they have no substance to them. Okay. Yeah. Cut to the next video. The next video is like 6 months later, and one of those very same Christians is doing a video now as an atheist, thanking the other street epistemologist for helping him see the error of his ways. During that conversation, he never let on that he was starting to doubt, but after he went away, those little seeds of doubt were already planted. The atheist had put a stone in his shoe, and it was effective. And this is the very same thing that I'm suggesting is the underlying philosophy of using the game plan. Let's just do some gardening. Let's just put a stone in their shoe. Let's get them thinking and watch what the Holy Spirit will do.
So before I went away, or before this happened, you asked me a question. And so just to quickly help you guys understand what just happened, my daughter's sick. She's at home with me right now, so she's playing on her iPad, and she came in here and she tripped over one of my lights. So bless her heart. I think she's feeling better, though. I think she'll be back to school tomorrow. So anyways, you asked me if reading tactics has helped me in any of my real life conversations, and the answer is yes. I was on an airplane coming back from, I think it might have been my trip to Denver. I don't know. It was either Denver or Brooklyn, and I was sitting next to a guy who actually there was someone in between us. There was three seats, and there was someone in between us. And I looked over, and this guy was like shuffling through some scientific-looking papers, and so I asked him a couple questions about those papers, and found out that he was a scientist about magnetic fields in outer space or something. And so then I was like, well, maybe this guy wants to think about religion, or maybe he's thought about it. So we had a conversation, and it turned out that he had been thinking about Christianity for a long time. He was an atheist or agnostic, and he had a series of objections to Christianity. And I remember reading in your book, when you're outgunned in this type of situation, to instead of just trying to defend yourself the entire time, ask them for literally a list of their objections to Christianity. And so that's what I did. I said, well, let's do this. So instead of like giving you an argument for God's existence, like the fine-tuning argument where I'm dealing with an actual physicist here who can just probably school me on all of it, instead of trying to do something like that, let me just ask you, what are your best objections? What are all of your objections to Christianity? And then after the plane ride, I'll take them home and look through them and see if there's any good ones. And if there are no good responses to these objections, then maybe I'll change my mind. I don't know. And so I did that, and I wrote them all down. And so that was a situation personally where that led me to have I think a better conversation and to learn more about this guy's objections instead of just trying to go on the defense or offense.
Yeah, I have a chapter on that called Two Maneuvers or something. I have to look at the title, but it's called Getting Out of the Hot Seat. And it's what you do when you find yourself, as you pointed out, that you are outgunned. Two reliable rescues is what I call it. And one deals with what I call the professor's ploy, and then this one is dealing with getting out of the hot seat. And you executed magnificently there and helped get an education. You didn't put yourself at risk. You realized you were out of your ken. And so you used it as an opportunity for your learning to make you better equipped to deal with these issues next.
And anybody can do that. You don't have to be a Old Testament or New Testament scholar in order to be like, well, what are your objections? Let's just like go over them, and I can write them down. And it was actually interesting when I asked him, like, I pulled out, I think it was just on my phone, and I was starting to type down his objections. I said, well, just give me your objections. Like, let me just list them down here. And that kind of took him by surprise, because you're not really ever in a situation where someone's asking you to list out all the premises in your argument and make sure that it's all logical and everything. So I think it may have caught him off guard. But I want to transition at this point to some Patreon questions from I asked my Patreon supporters for questions that they wanted to ask you related to tactics and everything. So this is the first one from Luke Mahadio. How often do you find yourself walking away from a discussion? How do you recognize when the best time to walk away is? How do you recognize if it's even worth speaking with someone in the first place?
Yeah, let me take them in reverse order. How do I recognize whether it's a good idea or not to speak with them? And the answer is you just have to test the waters. It's a very simple concept. You test the waters. You pay attention. You might toss out a little bait, so to speak. I'm a bass fisherman, so when I get on a lake I'm not familiar with, I have a reaction bait that I throw. In other words, I'm moving along, throwing it fast, seeing if I get any interest. If I see a fish flash on it a little bit, I say, okay, now I know I'm in an area where there's some fish, and I can slow down and use some other techniques. So in a certain sense, you want to throw out some chum, or you want to just pay attention to what's going on, and this is where a good question, like, what do you mean by that, can help you draw a person out a little bit. I don't think that every meeting is a divine appointment. That's not my view. I'm not thinking every time I get groceries at the store, okay, God wants me to talk to this person about Jesus, and so maybe I can get in a couple of words. Some people are like that. Ray Comfort, some folks know Ray. He's a great guy, and he's really good at that kind of stuff. And he's like a nonstop witnessing machine. Fine, I'm glad he's on our team, but most people are not like that, and that's not me. So I'm just trying to be alert and aware for opportunities, and then I might test the waters a little bit with a few questions to see what's going on, just like you were doing in the circumstance on the airplane. I'm on an airplane a lot, and I've had a lot of conversations like that. And,
yeah, I think one of the most difficult things to recognize, though, is to learn to when to stop the conversation, because that was one of the biggest downfalls, the things that I did wrong in my first conversation with my brother when he just became an atheist, is we talked for about 3.5 hours. Yeah. And it was not productive at all. We should have ended it after about 30 minutes. Right. So what are some tips there?
I have, at the very last chapter of the book, I have, it's called More Sweat, Less Blood, because if you sweat more in training, you'll bleed less in battle kind of things. And I talk about a guy on an airplane who was a Christian guy and really faithful to witness, but he did some great things, but he went overboard in certain situations. When you see that the other person is glancing about looking for the exit, that's probably a good time to draw your conversation to a close. What you don't want to do is you don't want to leave a bad taste in their mouth about the conversation by some attitude the Christian has, or some rudeness that they might display, or staying too long. Why can't we just let conversations die a natural death? By the way, this is a social skill that's important in all kinds of things. We talk to people, and if we're the ones doing most of the talking, sometimes we see the other person's eyes glaze over, or they're darting about, like glancing for the door, hoping someone will rescue them while we go on and on and on and on. If we're alert to those little body signals, then we can kind of draw it to a close, or possibly ask a question that brings the other person in and let them talk for a while. If people don't want to talk, I don't press the issue. Okay, if it seems like the discussion is getting hostile and intense, I don't press the issue. If it seems like they are just pushing their point of view, and it's clear that at this point they are not open to another point of view, I'm just going to go quiet, go dark on them a little bit, listen to what they have to say, and then move on. Remember, all I'm trying to do is put a stone in someone's shoe. I'm not trying to go the distance. But give them a couple things to think about, and then the discussion seems to go stale a little bit. I'm moving on. Go ahead.
This kind of relates to another question that a Patreon supporter asked. His name is Chris Stockman. He says, what would be a tactic for talking with someone who doesn't care or isn't thinking about the big questions?
Though I'm pausing because those are the hardest kind of people to deal with. And I make a point in chapter 2 that what I'm generally trying to do is I'm looking for people who are looking for me. So I don't spend a lot of time with people who don't want to hear what I have to say. They're just apathetic. And by the way, there's a lot of those people nowadays. They're into their own life. And what ends up happening for people like that much of the time is God's going to bring difficulties into their life that's going to get them thinking about these bigger issues. And if your listeners are faithful Christians as friends to them, and they are visible as Christians, then they'll be able to take advantage of those opportunities when the hard things really hit, and those people on an individual basis want to talk about ultimate issues. One question that might be asked, though, if you want to probe a little deeper, and I got this question from someone else, I don't remember who it was, but it's a good question. And the question is, what do you think happens when we die? What do you think happens when we die? So that introduces the spiritual issues in a very kind of not curious way, but in a way where you're expressing curiosity, okay, in the other person's views, and then just relax. Don't have it as a motive that you're asking this so you can tell them about Christianity. Don't go there yet. Just ask them to see what they say. And when they say they tell you what they think happens when they die, then you might ask them, why are those your convictions? Why do you think that's what happens? So there are two questions. What do you think happens? And then why do you think it? Now,
and this is perfectly in line.
Probes. Exactly.
This is perfectly in line with your idea of gardening, because you don't always have to hit a home run every time. You can just start to get them to think about their views and why they hold this view, and then maybe down the line the Holy Spirit will use this initial situation to eventually bring them to Christ. Sure.
Cameron, think about this. I'm just going back to your baseball metaphor, which I think is really good.
Well, it's yours, so
well,
I stole it from you.
Think of this. Some baseball players never hit a home run, but they're still good players. Think of it this way. Do you think a team or a manager wants somebody who can hit home runs now and again, or he would rather have somebody that can hit singles or doubles every single time they're up to bat? The singles and doubles are the things that matter more than the occasional home run. Because once you get on base, another person hitting singles and doubles could drive you in. So we do the small parts, we focus on the small things in a consistent way, and I think that's going to have a greater impact in the long run.
So I have another question from Sarah Todd. She says, I find it easier to think about suitable responses to people when I'm discussing online than in face-to-face conversation. Do you have any tips for thinking on your feet quickly in normal conversation, or is it just practice?
Well, almost nobody thinks well on their feet, just kind of out of the gates. People who seem to think well on their feet have thought beforehand, before there was pressure, about how they might respond. And when the issue comes up, then they have a response. So if somebody says, an atheist says to me, what about all the evil in the world? I'll say, what about it? Well, that's an argument against God. How is it? And then he might explain it. But I'll say, so you do believe in evil then? Of course I believe in evil. I said, well, you mean like real evil, or just things happen that you don't like? No, there's real evil, like rape and incest and murder and all that other stuff. Okay, well, that confuses me, I say. What do you mean? Well, if you believe you're an atheist. Yeah. Well, then I don't understand how you could believe in objective morality, real evil, as an atheist. Now, what I just did, this is an introduction to a conversation. Now, I'm actually writing a book with a whole bunch of introductions to conversations like that. I'm calling it Tactics on the Street or something, or hold on, I just got to write a word down here because I just said something I don't want to forget. They're just introductions. I'm not taking this one further, but notice I just did all of that. Bang, 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 bang. How could I do that? Because I'd already practiced it. I have it right there. And if they go in a particular direction, I've got a couple other things that I have already worked on. So your questioner makes a point. Do you do it quick on your feet, or does it take practice? And my answer is it takes practice, but the best way to practice is before you get in a circumstance. So if you can think of think of a challenge, something a person pushes at you, think of a question following the guidelines in the game plan, a question that can be productive for you. Some kind of, what do you mean by that question, or how did you come to that conclusion question? Or if you're aware of a liability, you can think of another question that might exploit the weakness or the flaw. But you think of these things in advance. Now, this is not very hard, Cameron, because your listeners are used to encountering people that maybe stonewall them sometime. All right, think of the issue that stonewalled you last time, and now before you get it again, before you hit the wall again, think of a question relative to that challenge that you can ask that can buy you some time or move you forward. That's all it takes. And then practice it a few times, and there it's in your toolbox. Then when it comes up, you're ready.
I think
people are good on their feet.
I think that's a great tactic. And you can use that in even in a formal debate setting. I was doing an interview with William Lane Craig, and I was asking him, because if you don't know who he is, he basically debates all these atheists all over the world, and he almost wins every single one of them. And so I asked him, well, how do you win all these debates? And one of the things he says he does in preparation is he writes down briefs of responses to potential objections they might raise. And so he does his preparation in advance so that he's not caught off guard. And so basically, I think Greg is saying something along the same lines here, is that if you do your preparation, you prepare in advance, then you can be better on your feet just because you've already done the prerequisite work. So let me, I think I have 2 or 3 more questions that I can try to squeeze in here for the last 8 to 10 minutes or so. Here's the last one, or the next one from Michael Riley. He says, do you ever plan to debate again? I would love to see his tactics in action against a YouTube atheist.
Well, I'm not particularly fond of debates. I won't say I will never do one again. I've done probably 10 or 12 on various formats, some on TV, some on radio and universities, etc. But there are a lot of liabilities to debates. And one of them is the best idea doesn't always win because there is gamesmanship that's involved in sounding persuasive. They also take a lot of preparation. So they're time intensive in terms of preparation.
Would everybody like to meet my daughter? Sorry, she's back over here. Come here, Cammie. I'm going to sit up here and say hi to everybody. Oh, this is my daughter, Cammie. She's not feeling too well.
Hey, sweetheart.
Can you smile and say hi? Nope. Can't do it. Can't do it. Okay. Let me get you set up here. Sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, that's all right. So one with debates is that they're time consuming. Another problem is the good idea doesn't always win as far as the audience is concerned because of the gamesmanship that's involved. So you have to be very careful. Also, generally debates are given to very polarized audiences, and I mean, look at everybody thinks their guy won.
Yeah.
In every case, I mean, I've been in some cases where the atheists were apologizing to me for the person that they invited to the debate on their behalf. So that happens once in a while. We didn't get our best guy. Well, why not? You could have done that. I think it's because their ideas are bad, principally, not because I'm a real good debater or the other person is poor. But in any event, in my mind, there's a question about how effective they can be. So I'm not really fond of doing those. It would have to take a very special set of circumstances for me to agree to it. I would rather give a talk to a hostile audience, make my points, and then have
let
Q&A
them think about it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let them think about it. Have some Q&A after. I think that's going to be more effective.
So next question is from Tanner Thomas. He says, what's your favorite argument for God's existence? And then second, what's the argument for God's existence that is most effective in casual conversation?
Well, it's hard to know which one is most effective, partly because you don't see the results of the arguments in a person's life right away, unless you have a long-term relationship with them and they're able to reflect back to you. When you said this, that really made a big difference. What I do a lot of times is I'll ask somebody who's a Christian who used to be an atheist, I'll ask them, what was persuasive to you? What made a difference for you when you were thinking about the issues? What was the most persuasive argument? So my favorite one is probably the moral argument. And the reason the moral argument, which basically says, if there is no God, there is no objective morality. But there is objective morality, therefore there is a God. Now, the reason this is so powerful is the second premise. But there is objective morality. A lot of people deny that. They say, well, no, morality is not objective. It's only subjective. It's all relative. If morality was all relative, then there would be no problem of evil. The problem of evil, however, is one of the most common complaints against theism.
Greg, I'm gonna have to let you. I'm gonna have to let you go again. I'm actually gonna put you on full screen, and I gotta go take care of her for 1 second.
Yeah. I'll take over. I've done this before.
Take over, Greg. I'll be right back.
No worries. Notice he's not yelling at his daughter. That's great. I'm glad to hear that. But sometimes it's frustrating. I think the moral argument is so persuasive because there's something that everybody knows, no matter where they live or when they live. And what they know is that something is wrong with the world. Things are not the way they're supposed to be. That's what the problem of evil is. You can't very well complain about the problem of evil and then consistently argue that there are no objective moral truths that make the concept of evil intelligible to begin with, okay? And I think this is the difficulty the atheist finds himself in. In fact, I was talking to an atheist on the air who was one of Bogosian's disciples, and using Bogosian techniques. And so when we got to this point in discussion, because he's talking about the evil God, I asked him where was he getting his standard, moral standard that he was used to judge God. And that's when we got in the discussion about objective standards. And of course, he believed that evolution grounded morality. But see, all evolution can do is give you subjective morality that's inside of you, that's your opinion because your genes have been selected to believe that. No evolution can make any act wrong. So what I asked him was, so what you're saying is when you complain about the problem of evil, or God who is doing evil, is you're saying God is doing things that is inconsistent with your personal evolution. So I'm just summing up the point, but in very clear terms. And he said, yes. It was amazing. He admitted it because he couldn't do any other, given the kind of argument that he was advancing. But of course, we all know better. He even knows better, deep on the inside. That's the inside-out tactic that I have a chapter on in the book. He knows better on the inside that there is objective morality, and that's why he's complaining about it. But you can't ground objective morality without an objective lawmaker, God. And therefore, that is why I think it's one of the most powerful arguments for the existence of God.
Well, Greg, thanks for coming on. I just want to remind everyone we were talking about tactics. Oh, hold up yours. You got the 10th anniversary edition.
Yeah, see, look at that nice red thing.
There, the gold emblem.
Edition. Yeah.
Yeah, so if you want to pick it up, then head over to, well, just check in the description of the video, or just go over to Amazon and search for it. It's really easy to find. It's about, I think it's like $17 right now for the paperback, and then $10 for Kindle. That's the one that I just purchased recently. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk to my audience about evangelism and all of your amazing tactics. So thanks again, Greg, for coming on.
Well, you're welcome, Cameron, and anytime, just give me a call. We'll chat some more, and you're doing great work. Keep it up.
Awesome. Really appreciate it. All right, and you guys have a good one. We'll see you later. I'm going to go take care of my daughter, so I'll see you later.